Basic psychology, operant conditioning and social learning theory.
Operant conditioning and Skinner's research.
Have you heard about operant conditioning and Skinner's research?
Yes, I have. It's fascinating how behavior can be learned through consequences.
Exactly. Skinner's research on rats popularized operant conditioning. He found that when a rat was rewarded with food for pressing a lever, it would continue to press the lever in the future.
That's positive reinforcement, right?
Yes, positive reinforcement strengthens a particular behavior that freely occurs, which makes it more likely to occur. Skinner also found that negative reinforcement works by removing unpleasant stimuli from happening.
So, if the rat was given unpleasant loud noises which it could switch off through the press of a lever, it would repeatedly press the lever to avoid unpleasant noises?
Exactly. Skinner found that negative reinforcement also reinforced behavior this way. He also found that when the lever led to punishments such as electric shocks being administered, the rats were less inclined to press it.
That makes sense. So, behaviorists propose that human behavior is learned this way?
Yes, they propose that human behavior is made more likely if perceived positive rewards are associated with engaging in particular behaviors. Aversive behaviors in humans are proposed to be negatively reinforced as we try to avoid unpleasant outcomes.
Interesting. So, punishment can stop a behavior from occurring altogether?
Exactly. Punishments cause some of our behaviors to cease completely. Operant conditioning evaluation.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of operational constraints?
Skinner's research into operant conditioning relied on the experimental method, which allowed the use of controlled conditions through the Skinner box. This allowed accurate predictions on behavior to be made.
That's interesting. What about the criticism that operant conditioning has relied heavily on animals such as rats and pigeons?
That's a valid point. Animals are significantly different from humans, and the findings may lack external validity to real-world situations for humans. This is because humans have free will and behavior is not so easily determined by positive or negative reinforcement.
I see. What about the influence of thoughts and cognitive processes on behavior?
Operant conditioning focuses only on observable behavior and does not factor in the influence of thoughts and cognitive processes. Due to this, operant conditioning cannot account for impulsive or spontaneous behaviors that people engage in sometimes that may have no perceived benefit. The explanation is too simplified and not holistic enough to explain all types of behavior.
That's a good point. What about the ethical and legal issues raised by the deterministic nature of operant conditioning?
That's a significant concern. Operant conditioning suggests that we do not have control over our behavior as we act merely on reinforcement, which is deterministic. This raises ethical and legal issues, especially if someone can argue they are not responsible for their own actions when committing crimes, for example, as they have no free will of their own, which behavioral explanations discount completely.
It seems operant conditioning has both strengths and weaknesses. What about the difficulty in generalizing the findings to humans?
That's a significant weakness. Although operant conditioning is easy to test and verify in laboratory settings with animals, experiments such as Skinner's box are contrived and have no mundane realism when applied to daily scenarios humans face. Meaning we may not be able to draw the same conclusions outside the artificial setting of a laboratory. Social learning theory.
What is Bandura's social learning theory?
Social learning theory suggests that learning occurs through observing the consequences of other people's behavior, both positive and negative.
That's right. It also states that individuals are more likely to imitate behavior if they can relate and identify with the model. Gender is one factor that can make identification with the model easier.
Bandura also found that behavior observed as rewarding by children was more likely to be repeated compared to behavior that was punished. This was called vicarious reinforcement.
Unlike behaviorism, social learning theory factors in internal cognitive processes that occur prior to imitation, known as meditational processes. These include attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation.
Right. Behavior must first grab the attention of the individual and then be remembered or represented mentally before the observer believes they have the ability to reproduce the behavior themselves. Lastly, there must be motivation for the observer to use the behavior in a given situation where they see the rewards of its use outweighing the potential costs.
Social learning theory evaluation.
The main supporting evidence for social learning theory comes from the Bobo doll study conducted by Bandura himself. It involved children observing aggressive and non-aggressive adult models and then being tested to see whether they would imitate the behavior themselves. Children in the aggression condition reproduced a good deal of physically and verbally aggressive behavior similar to the model.
That's interesting. Did Bandura conduct any other study to support his theory?
Yes, Bandura and Walters conducted a separate study to try and identify why a child would be motivated to perform the same aggressive behaviors in the absence of a model. They found that children's subsequent behavior was affected depending on which ending they had watched. This supports social learning theory and the idea of vicarious learning and reinforcement influencing the learning and imitation of behavior.
Are there any other studies that support social learning theory?
Yes, Fox et al., 2009, exposed participants to computer-generated virtual humans who either looked similar or different and engaged in exercise behavior or loitering behavior. They found that for participants who observed models that looked similar to themselves and engaged in exercise, they were more likely to engage in exercise behavior themselves when compared to participants who observed virtual models loitering who were different to them. This supports the idea of identification with the models being important for retention and imitation of behavior.
What are the strengths and weaknesses of social learning theory?
A strength of social learning theory is that it can be considered a more holistic approach than behaviorism, which focuses only on observable behaviors. Another strength is that it includes cognitive processes, which has more face validity as thoughts preceding behavior is something people can generally relate to. However, a weakness is that social learning theory cannot explain all behavior, particularly when there appears to be no apparent role model for individuals to have learned from. This weakness is more evident when imitation revolves around psychopathic behaviors or abnormal behaviors which are limited to just one individual within the family with no opportunity to learn from a model.